Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your program bringing news, views and information on religious liberty and in the US and of course around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my guest on this program is Professor John Reeve from Andrews University, Church History Department. Let's talk about church history, but your church and my church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the church that in many ways lies behind 3ABN, the assumption of the three angels' messages for an end-time scenario. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is an interesting movement that arose first in the United States, and as you and I were even talking before the program, it arose at a very critical time in the mid-1800s when the United States was barely a country. Yeah. I'm very aware that in the War of 1812, which foolishly the US began, England didn't even accept that it was a separate country by then. Right. And just a little detachment of English redcoats disembarked from a boat, and went up to Washington and took it by storm, burned the White House and went back to the ships. It was that easy. I mean, it's not to diminish America whatsoever. It's done incredible progress, but the point is it was a slow start. And so in those very beginnings of Americana or the American society here, this movement, the Millerite movement, developed, studying prophecies, convinced that it was the end was upon us and America was to play a key role. Didn't happen as William Miller thought, and then out of that disappointment developed the Seventh-day Adventist movement and the idea of a remnant final message to give to the world. Correct. That's the bigger backdrop, but of course something unique happened with this group that gave them a particular impetus for religious freedom. Let me hear your analysis of it, but it happened very, very early on, didn't it?
Well, one of the reasons that it happened to the Seventh-day Adventist group before there were even a Seventh-day Adventist group, there was just what they called themselves the little flock. It was a group of about 100 of the 50,000 Millerites that continue on together, seeking to find a biblical reason for the disappointment and how it all fit into biblical prophecy, and ended up eventually, about 20 years later, becoming the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Yeah. But early on, same as...
By the way, the church was formed almost just a year or two before the Civil War. So it was in the...
Correct.
At the time of great upheaval within the country.
Correct. So the early proto-Adventists, if we can call them that, were very aware that they have been trying to evangelize while being ignored for their differences.
Well, ignored at first and then kicked out. There was harassment and persecution. Yes,
they get kicked out first out of the churches that they were part of during the Millerite movement, and then they get kicked out of the post-Millerite movement itself.
That's true.
So they've had a lot of rejection. And in having a lot of rejection, they were trying to come to terms with how to provide rationally for their understanding as we have the right to do what we're doing, to study the Scripture for ourselves and to understand where God is leading us, etc. And so that mentality becomes part of the identity, that people should be able to study the Scriptures for themselves and follow the dictates of their conscience.
And I believe they picked up a lot of it very self-consciously from the Reformation, because they early on decided that they were in the tradition of the Reformation and the continuation of it. And so it came with the package.
But at the time when the church organizes into a church, the Seventh-day Adventist group, proto-Seventh-day Adventist group, whatever we're going to call them, organizes themselves into a church during the Civil War. And during the Civil War, one of the things that was very part and parcel with the dynamic of this new group was, should we fight or should we not?
Yeah.
And if they are not going to fight, then suddenly they're going to be up against the conscriptions and the laws that are saying you must fight if you are conscripted.
Well, you could buy your way out of the conscription, as
Yeah, but not all of us were rich.
No, and not, yes, not too many of the early Adventist group were.
That's correct.
No.
So then the idea that I should be forced to fight even though my conscience does not allow me to fight was part and parcel with the early Adventist understanding of we must maintain religious liberty.
Yeah, you're right. There's a connection between it. What's interesting to me is Ellen White, who was recognized from the very beginning having a spiritual role to play in the messages that she gave to that group. She said that God's punishment rested on the South for their embrace of slavery. So if there was ever a just war or a moral cause for the Civil War, she'd given it. And yet they decided, consistent with Bible truth, that a Christian really shouldn't be part of these wars.
Yeah. Well,
and yet this passed the muster of a just war.
Well, to be fair, she also
on the old scenario.
She also said that God's judgment had fallen on the North for their toleration of slavery for so long.
Well, that's true.
So,
but there's no question that in her general comments, she saw a great problem in the South, and she and many of the original pioneers were quite sympathetic to the anti-slavery movements.
That's correct.
And some of them were even involved in the Underground Railroad.
That's correct. And Ellen White comes across, as did Joseph Bates and James White, as far as that, and the three of them are often called the three founders of Seventh-day Adventism. Together, one of the things that they strongly agreed on was that there should not be slaves.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair to American history, a lot of the founding fathers were of the same view. They just didn't have the moxie to buck the system.
Yeah, well, George Washington was.
Well, no, he's not one of the ones.
Well, he's a case in point, though, in that he freed his slaves at the death of his wife.
Which almost sounds like he didn't like his wife too much. I wouldn't have wanted to be a slave owner whose slaves knew that depended upon the death of the owner for their freedom. I mean, she needed a food taster, I would think.
Yeah.
No, but I don't think George Washington is as easily exonerated as some of the others. In fact, he even went as far as when he was up in the north, he would rotate his slaves back on regular intervals to keep them in their servitude, because if they stayed too long in the north, what was it, Philadelphia or whatever, they could technically be allowed to be free. And so I've read his biography in great depth on it, and on excuses, they need to be sent home to visit their relative, whatever. And then one escaped, a woman, and he had the authorities chase her down. But in the end, she was supported by the community, and he couldn't extract her. So he was not just ambivalent, he was rather actively engaged in keeping his slave system going. But Jefferson and others, I think, in fact, Jefferson said it was going to cause trouble sooner or later.
Yeah. But indeed, it did cause trouble. And when it did cause trouble, many of the early Adventists were blatantly anti-slavery, and therefore the Civil War had the smackings of a just war, and yet they argued that they should not kill.
Which makes it, it proves to me it was a more reasoned response. That's really my point.
Yeah.
They had personal and even immediately moral reasons for getting involved in it, because there was a great wrong at work. But they saw evidence from the Bible that they were not to enter into these civil feuds and violence against other human beings.
and the conscription of soldiers from the communities of the North were the law that they were bucking when they started to articulate clearly a religious freedom.
Yes. And then the other thing that was a clear reality, I think when there were only about 25,000 Adventists, as many as 900 to 1,000 of them were severely fined and some imprisoned over the blue laws.
Yeah.
So they saw the consequence of being a little different.
And of course, the blue laws were having to do with laws enforcing Sunday keeping, and the absence of working on Sunday was what the Adventists would get in trouble for.
Well, they'd get in trouble for plowing their fields on Sunday.
That's correct.
Not working somewhere else, and not even working for money, just keeping your fields.
Yeah.
It was an interesting era.
But it is at the point where they were getting in trouble for breaking laws of the land that they turned their attention to the need for religious liberty.
Yeah.
And how did that first get articulated?
Religious liberty?
Within the Adventist community.
Well, this was the point that I was going to make. The record is hard to find in great detail, but it's very plain that religious liberty within Adventism came to the fore with the editorship of A.T. Jones, Alonzo T. Jones, who ironically or interestingly had joined the Adventist Church as he left the military. There was an ex-soldier.
Yes.
And I'm great on parallels, and it's interesting that Ignatius Loyola of the radical Catholic Reform foot soldier movement, he came from the military. Yeah. And within Adventism, it took a military man, although he was not an Adventist when he was in the military, but I think he brought the military sensibility. He was go, 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 and one battle after another. But from all that I've read, his emphasis on religious liberty came not directly from the persecutions they were undergoing. They spoke a bit about laws and all the rest, but it was end-time oriented. They believed that going into the final events that they thought were months, at most years away, they would be forced by persecuting powers to give up their faith. So it was an end-time direct, like a Diocletian type persecution they expected. And so they were proclaiming the principle in an end-time concept, prophetic. It can't be separated from it.
That's correct. So it's reading the scripture that brought them,
right.
In the A.T. Jones era, it was reading the scripture that brought them to the understanding that we must provide religious freedom because it's going to be taken away.
And then, of course, in 1888, they believed with a major proposal for a Sunday bill, the Blair Bill. Senator Blair had brought in a piece of Sunday legislation that went beyond normal blue laws that would have mandated no work of any kind in the whole country, and with a recommendation at first, but probably enforcement later, that you had to go to church. So it was an overtly religious Sunday law. And they saw this as the final law that was predicted in Revelation. And A.T. Jones trumpeted this big time. And of course, some Adventists remember, he then called for a revival so that they could be spiritually prepared for the final push. And so religious liberty for Adventists was all about prophecy. It always included using the law to defend your situation in the workplace. And today, many people think that that's our main emphasis. But it never was and should never be. We're looking at the larger picture of really where we are in time and what's at stake. That this is a cosmic battle between good and evil, and between freedom and those who would restrict your right before God.
But it's not just restrict your right.
Anyone's right.
It's restricting anyone's
and
rights.
Thank you for reminding me. We
key.
say it constantly, and it's worth repeating on this program as often as we can. For us, as we read the Bible and with the Adventist history in mind, when we promote religious liberty, of course it's for us, but it's for everybody at the same time.
Right.
And it's for your right to be wrong.
Yeah.
We would hope you would get it straight, but if you get it wrong and are convicted on it, fine. You have as much right to believe that as anyone else. God gave Adam and Eve the ability to make a wrong choice. there were consequences. There'll always be natural consequences, but we're not called upon to punish people as the consequence of their bad choice. They have to live before God on that. And at root, what our view of religious liberty that came from the Reformation, and of course way back to Eden, is that we recognize we're all creatures of a God who gave us free choice, and we exercise that before God. Nobody else has a right to interfere in that. Not governments, not churches, nobody.
But historically then, even though Adventists, like many other groups, address their first concerns about religious liberty with their own restriction of it, and their feeling that they are being restricted.
There's no question that it was personalized by the group,
But the core of the teaching comes from interpreting prophecy from Scripture and understanding the cosmic dynamics of this, and it is a good versus evil, therefore it must be for all or it isn't for any. Absolutely. It becomes the concentration of the Adventists in understanding that they must provide religious freedom for others.
Absolutely. Let's take a break before we come back and continue this discussion of religious liberty from an Adventist perspective, its own beginnings, and how it's to be seen in the larger sense for all men and women and all peoples. Stay with us. Welcome back to Liberty Insider. Before the break, with guest John Reeve, we were going over some Adventist history to explain why religious liberty is so important for Adventists today. And it is. It's, it's one of the departments within our church, but as far as the member support and the money and so on, it's unchanging over the years. It's a consistent support, and as you said very succinctly, it's tied up to our doctrinal worldview.
Yeah, and as such, we as a people need to be careful to make sure we're not just getting religious liberty for Sabbath keepers. We need to make sure that we're getting religious liberty for all people, for all faiths.
Well, I made a comment, remember making a comment to some seminar groups at the time of the last presidential election, and as you know, and many of our viewers know, a Seventh-day Adventist was one of the contenders for president. And of course, that was exciting for many individual Adventists, but I don't think they'd all thought through what that meant. And so I said to them at one stage, what are you expecting from such a person? In this case, we knew who it was, but whoever, any Adventist running. I said, you want them to act the same way as president toward Adventists that we feared that President Kennedy would act toward Catholics? And he didn't. Kennedy kept a good separation of church and state.
Correct.
But, it's nice that he perhaps, this doctor was one of our company. But if president, you would expect him to be engaged with civil governance and facilitating the full freedom of religious liberty for all people. He can't afford to be playing favorites. And I said, and I also said in that context, it's worth thinking about, if we had a president or a government or whatever entity in the government that passed an edict saying now that the seventh-day Sabbath by law is to be the day everyone keeps, that would be as wrong as what we fear that Sunday, one day, will be designated under pain of law as the day. Yeah. We don't believe in religious legislation for the state to tell people how to practice their faith, even if what they're requiring is good. In fact, it's the litmus test of religious liberty. If there's coercion involved, it's not religious liberty.
Coercion. That's an interesting concept. What kinds of coercion equal coercion? I mean, you've got obvious laws with consequences as
fines
coercion.
And penalties like that, imprisonment. Ellen White once goes through it. She says it's mockery, then harassment, and then fines, imprisonment, and death.
Yeah.
Doesn't start off at the end point, but they're all wrong.
Right.
And they're all trying to take away the right of the individual to make the choice.
So what's the difference between a mob rule view of religious liberty and a democratic view of religious liberty?
Very perceptive question. Well, and I'm sure you ask it because the intimation is given to Seventh-day Adventists that at the end of time, a national Sunday law, which takes its cue from Revelation, where it says, you know, the mark of the beast, they're all required to obey this certain dictate. And we believe, and we're told, that it will be people clamoring to the legislators for such a law.
Yeah. And
it does trouble me, since the 2000 election, in the main, the population seemed to believe that if the majority wants something, they should get it.
Yeah. Well, and even in the Supreme Court, the question is often, is the population ready for such and such a law?
Right.
As opposed to, is such and such a law just? Does it fit into the society?
And anybody that does a bit of study in American history knows that the sometimes wise men that put things together had a great fear of the mob rule, of people rising up as a body and demanding something. Yeah. And a lot of the mechanisms of law, and certainly the Bill of Rights fits in with this, is designed to protect the minority from the majority.
Correct. And at its heart, religious liberty must fall into that category.
Absolutely. But it's reminding me of an incident that I listened to on BBC a few years ago. There was an interview with the foreign minister of the Maldives, and he was representing his country very well in the interview, portraying it as an island paradise, and it's in the tropical area, nice country, very low-lying. It's at risk of global sea level rising, of disappearing totally. But anyhow, he portrayed it very nicely, an idyllic place, wonderful society, free and all the rest. And the interviewer said, but now what about religious freedom? Oh, no, and that's right. He says, what about religious freedom? Oh, yes, we have religious freedom. Absolutely. He says, although the population is pretty much 100% Muslim, so it's not an issue. And the interviewer says, well, you know, I'm a Christian. He says, would I be allowed to go to your country and practice my faith? And I'll never forget the response. The guy suddenly reacted with horror. He says, certainly not. He says, we might as well invite Al-Qaeda into our country. So, you know, things were peaceful there according to him because they're all the same. Right. Whether or not anyone had tried to change their religion, probably not. Probably know that it wouldn't be allowed. But the issue hadn't been tested. But when it's tested, they're not going to allow this. And we need to keep that in mind, that the majority are often very comfortable, but you test the principle by the minority in this case. I do think we're heading toward this idea that the majority, if they want it, they get it. And there's a strong move in the US that I think is very problematic, not just from a religious liberty point of view, from civil governance. There's a strong move to do away with the electoral college and the Senate. You know, why should some states have more power than the size would warranty, to set it up so the majority of the population will get what they want. And of course, part of this is that the president will be elected by a pure majoritarian vote, but they don't understand why it was set up. It was precisely to spread the influence first, and maybe even first, precisely to protect the minority from the majority. Yeah.
You know, in those original colonies, you have, we talked at the very beginning here about the fact that many of the Church of England people that came over represented different subsets of the Church of England in different colonies. Like Virginia was one, and then Massachusetts is another, and then of course you have the Catholics in Maryland, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's my view on why things worked so well here, because it had balkanized the situation so much that no one party had any chance of a majority, so they were all rather agreeable with each other on the national level, not on the state level. Yeah. The national level, it made perfect sense to have freedom for all and no favoritism from the federal government.
Yeah, which allowed, because of the fact that there was no single majority but a whole bunch of minorities, religiously speaking, it allowed the environment of, we have to be allowing for the minority rights because everybody was a minority. Yeah. So in a situation where you end up with a majority taking over, can that majority actually look out for the rights of the minority. In a world where we are more and more getting polarized, can the polarization look out for minority rights? Religious liberty at its heart must be for all, or it's not for any.
Sometimes with all the emphasis on the health message and doing good things in the community, even Seventh-day Adventists can become a little forgetful of the prophetic and end-time thinking that gave rise to this church organization. In the mid-1800s, people in America were stirred by social change, and many Bible-believing Christians were convinced the end of the world was upon them. It seems sort of quaint if you look back on it on that way. But today, look at science fiction. Almost every science fiction show and many television programs are positing the end of the world in an apocalyptic sense. But for Adventists today, the prophecies that inform Millerites and Adventists back then should be present today and the dynamic that guides us, because the headlines scream at us that this and these are the end times. And what's to come? First, a great proclamation of liberty throughout the land, and then the call should go out that the Liberator, the Creator, is coming in the clouds of glory. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.